error occurred. Hang on. Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. Well, so far today, we have talked about the reaction of Stalin back in Russia. We've talked about the experience of the men in the boats and the gliders and in the aircraft. We've talked about some of the naval aspects. But what we haven't talked about yet is really what the reaction was of the people within the country that was invaded, France. So it's hard to find French historians who want to speak in English about the history, but I have a person to turn to. And my person for this subject is Michael Neiberg, of course, regular visitor, who is a massive, great fan of France and its culture and has written about all the most important aspects of France and its dealings with America and the world and Vichy. And so I'm bringing a good afternoon, Mike. How are you today? Well, it's morning.
It is morning. Yeah, no, great to be here with you. And yeah, great to be talking to you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So I kind of summed it up there. You know, France is where it unfolds, but of course there are different aspects of what we consider France, because we've talked, you know, not that long ago about, you know, Operation Torch and things like that. So the France's empire has already had experiences that are changing. Then there's the French government sort of in exile in the UK and de Gaulle. Then there's the Leclerc's division is preparing to come into Normandy later on. Then there's the occupiers being the Germans, and there's the French people who are under the bombs. So it's a lot to unravel, but let's start with whichever bit you want to start with. You know, how did the news break in France? Let's start with that.
Yeah, it's a political mess, as you said. It's not entirely clear who is going to govern France. De Gaulle does not yet have any sort of mandate from anybody. As most of your viewers will know, he's not particularly popular in either London or in Washington. That's to put it quite mildly. He himself has already decided that he's going to use this moment. He's going to play his cards and he's going to take political control of France. It's far from clear that the Americans and the British are going to let him do that. That's another story we can talk about if you like, because I think it's kind of fascinating. So there is this kind of open question about what French governance is going to look like. Is Vichy going to be wiped off the table, or will the Americans find some way, as many Americans wanted to do, to reach out to some of the more moderate Vichy officials as they saw it, and try to cut a deal with them to ensure some sort of stability, which is what they had done in North Africa, leaving Vichy officials in charge in North Africa, while the Americans and British pursued the Germans into Tunisia. So there is an existing model to do this. As you know, there's also a plan for an American military occupation of France that never gets executed, but there is a plan to do it. So one of the big questions, one of the enormous open questions, is who is going to govern France when this is done? There is no really clear answer to that question, I think, in anybody's mind except Charles de Gaulle's. De Gaulle certainly has a plan for what he's going to do about that. And it's one that he executes and executes quite successfully. So we can talk about the political dimensions if you want. I think we also need to talk about what this does to French civilians, the people who are just trying to survive day to day.
Yeah, we'll move to civilians very quickly. But de Gaulle, I think, are we a little bit burdened 80 years on with the fact that as soon as I say de Gaulle, everybody watching this, the instant picture of, you know, the gentleman with the big outer, as the British would joke about it, there we have an image, and we know what he was like. We know he was tall, but the reality is that he wasn't necessarily the best known person. 44, a little bit more so, but certainly a couple of years. We've talked about this. He was, in some ways, he was kind of the last horse in the race. In some ways, as opposed to necessarily the favorite in the race. Although that's a big, I was going to say rabbit hole, but horse hole there. But because de Gaulle isn't. How well ranked how well known was de Gaulle in France in 1944?
So I think there's two things we definitely want to begin to talk about. The first is, whenever I go to France, and I'm talking about this with American friends, especially, and British friends who come with me, or who I'm with in France, those metal placards that I know were in Bayeux too, with his BBC address.
Yeah.
And I read those placards. It's the speech that he gave. It's the end of that speech that he gave in June 1940. And what I tell folks is, let's break this down quite carefully, word by word. In June 1940, de Gaulle predicted exactly how this war was going to end. So what I tend to think of that statement as, it is a statement of French strategy. It's the only statement of strategy I'm aware of from June 1940 that comes out to be true. So in de Gaulle, I don't necessarily see him as the last guy who's standing out of a mess of political,
Mm.
out of a political mess that is France. I kind of see him as this very skillful political operator
Yeah.
who is
Mm.
eliminating his rivals one by one. And by the time June 1944 has come across, I don't think Churchill and Roosevelt fully know it, but he's elbowed them out of the way as well. So this thing that they create called the Provisional Government of the Republic of France, de Gaulle just dropped the word provisional. Like this
Mm.
is the government of France. And his presumption all along was that the Vichy government was illegitimate. It had no right to do anything. That and this is the arrogant part of him that the British and the Americans detested so much. That what's left of the French government, what's left of French traditions, is embodied in Charles de Gaulle, and that's the attitude that he takes right from the beginning. So I think he's in a much more powerful political position than the British and Americans realized. I think de Gaulle was happy to keep them in the dark for as long as possible so that he could continue to do the things that he was doing. So when I look at de Gaulle, I mean, the line that I've sometimes used with people, if I were American, I would have wanted him in jail. If I were French, I would have wanted him crowned king for life. I mean, he's the guy who is keeping the sovereignty of France. He's keeping the independence of France whole so that when this war is over, France had no business to come out of the Second World War with an occupation zone in Germany, a
No, not really.
Security Council
Mm.
seat in the United Nations. Like, there was no reason why France should have emerged in that powerful position that it did. The only reason it did is because of what de Gaulle does in these months in 1944.
I mean, that's a very good point. And, you know, if we think about the different complexities people like Churchill and FDR are dealing with in 44, not least of which their own physical health, particularly FDR. You know, they're looking at empire and the Southeast Asia and post-war Europe and the potential of Cold War and harmony and racial tensions in the USA and all these things. That de Gaulle, I suppose, in that sense, has one clear aim, and that is a new republic with him ideally at the top of that republic, and that single-mindedness to know to kind of drive for that, as you said there, from kind of 1940
Yeah.
onwards. He's very driven.
With almost no resources to do it except his
Yeah.
drive and his will and the small, relatively small, he has Leclerc's Second Armored Division, which is representing him. But when you think about the massive task that he has set for himself and you think about the resources that he has to execute that task, there's an enormous gap between those two things.
Yeah.
And the Americans and British, they're not really sure what they want to do with France. There is a large group of people that say, look, if we're going to occupy Italy and we're going to occupy Germany, there's no necessary reason we shouldn't be occupying France as well. That, this is a collaborative Vichy government.
Yep.
This is a system that's going to need to be rebuilt. If we don't occupy it, it may very well slide into civil war, which is a very real possibility in France. De Gaulle is the figure who says none of that is going to happen. French sovereignty is going to be vested in the French people. It's going to be vested in whoever they elect, which is going to be Charles de Gaulle. And he has this ability to reach out both to the right and to the left in French. Maybe not in France, maybe not at the ultimate extremes, but he does a brilliant political job uniting many former Vichy people and many former socialists and people on the left, and at least getting them to the point to agree that there's going to be elections, and whoever the French people elect, de Gaulle, is going to be the rightful representative of their interests in the international and national spheres. And just again, I teach at the Army War College where we talk about this all the time. What is your strategic aim, and what are the resources you have to get there? And that gap in between is risk. And the risk that de Gaulle is running is unbelievable. And the only way you can close that gap is the sheer force of his personality. Now, if you're Roosevelt or Churchill at the blunt end of that, you're going to receive it a little bit differently. But again, I tip my cap to him for being able to close that gap, minimize that risk, and achieve the thing that in 1940 he said he was going to achieve.
That's a very good way of putting him. I like, it's like when on this channel we have people coming, pro and against MacArthur, and Mark Clark has been the big subject of conversation throughout May. And I was in the James's Holland's car with him a couple of days ago. He's a massive Mark Clark fan now, and there are other people who are less of a Mark Clark fan. But I like to be presented the different views of people so that I constantly changing my position as people give me a convincing argument. But before we move on to the civilians, do you think Churchill and FDR and perhaps Eisenhower did they misjudge Churchill? Did they kind of dismiss him? Do they understand how cool and calculating he could be, or did they just kind of dismiss him a bit, you think?
I don't think they were dismissive, but I think they were focused, as they were in North Africa, on the goal of defeating the German army. So the Americans really don't want to try to govern France for all kinds of reasons. It would be extraordinarily difficult to do. The American-French relationship has always been quite complex, but it has always had there's always been a kind of closeness to it. Even today, we refer to the French as our first allies. There's a complexity to that, and I get all of that. It's what do they call it? There's a convenient lie that So the Americans don't want to go into France and be seen as a negative or occupying force. They want to turn governance over to the French as quickly as possible. What I think they misjudged in de Gaulle was the way in which he did find a way to get the pulse of the French people and to distill that in a way that Henri Giraud could never do, in a way, ironically, that Pétain did do, though in a very different way. De Gaulle's able to do that, and he's the only guy, I think, in France in 44-45 who could have done that would have been acceptable both to the French people and grudgingly acceptable to the British and to the Americans. But what de Gaulle did is make it impossible for the British and the Americans to stay in France as an occupying power.
Well, the general has spoken, a sidebar there, General Patterson. Often de Gaulle's arrogance is cited, but the Allies' arrogance that they could control France and de Gaulle is staggering.
No, I just had this conversation yesterday in a slightly different tone, but a friend of mine who's a Latin America specialist who said that when the Americans refer to Latin America as their backyard, the Latin Americans rightly read that as America claiming ownership of it. And the Americans did something sort of similar. We liberated this, therefore it's ours to decide its destiny. And the French answer is no, it's not, right? I mean, you're here to defeat the German army. We're going to play our role in that to the maximum extent that we can do. And I think we vastly underestimate how quickly France did rebuild military power. And, how they went all the way to the Eagle's Nest. I mean, this is a military force that built itself up from scratch. But governance is going to come from a mandate from the French people. And that's, that's the fundamental, I think, base question. Is France to be a conquered nation or a liberated nation? And once you accept the reality that it's a liberated nation, it's very difficult to come in and do anything other than turn it over politically to French people.
Brilliant response. And I think it dovetails nicely where we're going to go next with the French civilians, because, we're absolutely slap bang in the middle of all these commemorative ceremonies happening. President Biden has spoken and Macron has spoken, and et cetera, et cetera. I haven't heard any of the speeches yet. I will do that on recap later on. But we're seeing, so in some ways, Normandy as this arena of where other nations came and did their thing to bring back liberation. And although the French are the crowds, the French are the participators in these ceremonies, and they are the ones that are hosting, perhaps the French role in terms of civilians is nudged aside because of the way we look at that. And there's still debate about exactly how many French civilians were killed under Allied bombs and how many were made homeless. But obviously you have a perspective on this. So take us through your viewpoint on the French civilian experience. Because hearing about D-Day, if you're in New York when the headlines broke, is very different to hearing about it if you're in Amiens or Paris or Marseille. So the French point of view.
Yeah, before I get to that, let me just close one more loop on de Gaulle. De Gaulle never really saw Operation Overlord as an Allied operation. He saw it as an American-British operation that happened to take place in France. He was much more likely to attend an anniversary of the Provence landings, Dragoon Anvil, because of course that contained a lot of French soldiers. So that was a French operation to liberate France that went very well, got into Marseille and Toulon very quickly, and all the things that we know about the Southern operation. For French civilians, I mean, there are at least two major worries that I think we do underplay, and I think we have changed our narrative over time, as you note. I doubt these will be large themes here in Normandy this week, but one of them, of course, is the fear of German retribution and what they will do. And we know from places like Oradour what the Germans were capable of when it came to retribution. But if the Allies don't get off the Overlord beaches very quickly, and if they don't begin to move inland very quickly, you face this risk of massive German retribution for any acts that are done to help the Allies, which is why the courage of members of the French resistance to me remains a source of some wonder. The second issue is a very practical one, and you know this from living there, Paul. Normandy is a major, massive food source
Yep.
to the rest of France. It's dairy, it's beef, it's fruit, it's Calvados, it's cider, all of those wonderful things that Normandy is so well known for, which is now cut off for supply into the rest of France. And so you have two things going on. Normandy is the produce and food that's coming from Normandy, especially to Paris, which, as you know, is not very far away. That is no longer coming to Paris. And to the extent that the Germans are aware that their time in Normandy may be coming to an end, they are not sending a lot of that food to Paris. They're sending it back to Germany. So it produces an immediate hunger crisis that will eventually be the thing that convinces Omar Bradley that the Allies have to make a run for Paris. It is this fear that the city is literally going to starve to death. So there are those two things that play in immediately. And again, I don't mean to, well, let me just state it this way. As we all know, the Allies don't get off the beaches as quickly as they had hoped. So there is also the fear that this could turn into a Dieppe at a higher level, or it could turn into something like Anzio or Salerno, where the Allies land, but they don't actually move inland too quickly. That's kind of a worst case scenario for everybody except the Germans. If the Allies get stuck in an Anzio situation in Normandy, then you're really looking at an extremely difficult circumstance. And those bombers are also likely to come back in large numbers. So it's not, as you said, if you're living in Chicago or Pittsburgh or wherever you are and you hear the Allies have landed, that's an unadulterated good thing.
Yeah.
If you're living in France, it's not quite as evident. So I think sometimes we do underplay just how difficult this is on a day-to-day basis for people who are trying to keep their families alive, trying to get food to them, especially if you're living in a big city and you don't have those connections directly to the land where the food is coming from.
And on a personal thank you to you, your book about Paris, I don't think I fully understood the humanitarian crisis that built up before and after D-Day in Paris, and just, you know, the complete lack of food, and it turned my vision of my viewpoint 180 on the Leclerc and pushing off and Bradley to Paris, because I'd always sort of seen it from a military point of view, and you kind of squarely told me that in the book that there's a crisis going on there, and I don't think I'd been aware of that. So thank you for that. But you mentioned the French resistance there, and I know it's a massive, great subject, but of course the Operation Overlord all ties up with Operation Fortitude and Deception, and this, it's not all happening in Normandy that day. There's all these electronic warfare things happening up and down the coast, and it's fair to say that SOE agents, OSS agents, resistance in other parts of France are being, if they're not being directly lied to by the Allies, they are being kind of told slightly duff information about the invasion coming, and people are going out and doing stuff. They're revealing themselves. They're activating their groups, thinking something's happening, and something did happen, but it didn't happen necessarily near them. Do you think the Allies used the resistance a little bit for their own purposes, and not betrayed them is a strong word, but was it entirely sporting what they did?
So it is the case that the Allies don't know that they can trust the resistance, and that's for two reasons. The one reason is, of course, that it's entirely possible that the Germans have broken those cells, right? I mean, we know what the Germans were up to. We know they were torturing French resistance people. We know they were turning some of them. So if you tell the French resistance, hey, the landing's going to come between Cherbourg and Le Havre, and here's the day we're going to do it, and here's what's going to happen, there is a genuine risk that you're going to reveal that. The second thing that the Allies are very, very worried about, I think the Americans probably a little more than the British, the most successful of these French resistance cells, left-leaning political component. And there is a worry in the United States that if you give the left communist and socialist resistance too much power, and there is a power vacuum and sort of chaos at the end of this, it could be the communists and socialists who step in. So every now and again, you will hear an American officer say, we don't want de Gaulle to turn into Kerensky. And what they mean is the 1917 example, where there's a power vacuum when the Tsar falls, and it is the Bolsheviks who step into it. There's no point in liberating France only to see the Bolsheviks take it over in 1945. This is the perspective from Washington. So if some of these resistance groups are left-leaning and do not share in the same political goals, then they may very well leverage American and British military power to take political power. And that is a circumstance that nobody wants. So one of the reasons that the Americans eventually decide de Gaulle is the man they're going to have to support is de Gaulle's able to cut a deal with the French left, which is to say, I'm not going to squash you. We're going to have elections when all this is over. And if you win, we'll put you into the government. You know, what we're going to do is build to a point where we're going to have elections. So there is no risk if de Gaulle's in charge of either a civil war or a Bolshevik coup. So it's really, really complicated. And I would say the other thing the Americans and British are concluding, if we're going to send paratroopers and pathfinders and all these other people into harm's way, there's no reason why the French shouldn't go into harm's way as well. This is a giant allied multinational effort to free France. Risks will be taken. And there's no reason why all of those risks should be American, Canadian, and British.
A very good point. Yeah, I don't know what to say to that. Brilliant. I love listening to you, Mikey. I've got a man crush. I had a man crush on Neil Zone. Now I've got a man crush on you again. It's a lack of sleep as well. But no, moving along. The French losses, which, as I said earlier, when there's still debate about how many thousands were killed, and then there's a transportation plan, and that brings up the question of just how valid it was. And some people said it was absolutely thoroughly important. Others say no, it wasn't. And these are things that we still debate about that. Do you? I know you're not so much in that sense the pure military historian. You're more the sort of geopolitical, although you are a military historian. You're everything. But where were you on the transportation plan and the bombing, for example?
Well, I mean, it's one of those things, you know, where you stand depends on where you sit. If I'm Dwight Eisenhower, I want the Air Force destroying anything and everything that the Germans can use to bring military force into that Lodgeman area. I completely understand where Eisenhower and his staff were coming from. That's what air power in his mind is for, especially if you conclude, as Eisenhower and many others concluded, that this strategic bombardment of Germany was not producing the effect. Remember, the bomber mafia pledge, so to borrow, I won't quote the man who wrote the bad book, but the bomber guys sort of they sort of promised, if we bomb ball bearing plants and we bomb factories, then there will be no German military force to get to France because they won't have equipment and they won't have oil and they won't have whatever. That's clearly not true, as Overlord is coming to fruition, the months leading up to Overlord. So I completely understand what Eisenhower was saying, that we have to target these things. And again, I guess it's one of the great tragedies of war. I sort of understand Eisenhower's presumption, again, that not all risks and not all casualties should be taken by Americans, British, and Canadian soldiers, that the French people have an obligation and they're going to be in the line of fire. It's going to happen. So I guess I understand his perspective on all of that. You know, one does wish that the American and British bombers had a greater degree of accuracy in the technology that they were using, other than what the Air Force calls gravity-guided munitions. It would have been nice to have something more precise, but that's the reality of war. And, you know, it's the same question with bombing the concentration camps, and it's the same question with so many issues in World War II. This is a circumstance when millions and millions of people are being killed. I guess I understand Eisenhower's strategic direction to say our principal goal is to get this war over with, much in the way that Grant did in 1864 and 1865. Are there risks to that strategy? Absolutely. It's hard for me to see an alternative approach that would have reduced casualty anymore. That's a long-winded answer, but I hope it makes some sense.
It's not a long-winded. It's fantastic. So, I know we said an introduction there. You know, you love France, you speak French, you come here regularly. Historiography, we are re-evaluating D-Day all the time, and Market Garden and Midway. The French reaction to D-Day was does that need revision? Are we there with understanding it? Do we have more work to do? Where should the work be coming from? I mean, I struggle to find French guests for my channel. I sent 5 emails out recently trying to find someone to talk about the French Expeditionary Force in Italy, and I didn't get a single reply. And so it's where are we in putting the French into the D-Day and Normandy story?
Well, I think for France, the Second World War is really for a lot of French people, it is still a civil war. It is still in their minds. You know, there are historical memories and family memories and individual memories that make this extremely complicated. And when I was having dinner with two of my French friends in Montparnasse when I told them that I was going to write the Vichy book that I wrote, and they both literally they physically pulled back when I told them the next book that I was writing, and they both said to me, "This is not a good idea. Like, don't do this." No French publisher has come to me interested in doing a French version of that book. I have not been asked yet to speak in France on that book. I get asked to speak in France a lot. I love coming to France. I'm coming again in a couple of weeks. But on that topic, nothing. No podcasts, no op-eds, no nothing. So there is still a, what Henri Rousseau called the Vichy syndrome that is still very, very active in France, where it is just difficult, I think, because you're touching on family history, you're touching on, as living there. I mean, what Eric Zemmour was able to do with Vichy and stir that up to create a political movement inside France. I think that's where we need to get to, and we need to get to a point where, and France is getting much better at this, but to have an honest conversation about what Vichy was, what those years meant, and what military force means in the national experience, because military force in France and the military in France also kind of has a political association, and I think those are difficult things to discuss in France. Not because anybody is telling people not to discuss them, but because they raise some very uncomfortable questions. And I had another conversation with some people in France. They were friends of friends. And after a couple of minutes sitting there and having a nice glass of wine and talking, they opened up and said, our grandfathers were Vichy. And they were doing some things that, we know about that we're not very proud of. And they were doing things that we probably don't know about. So that's a difficult conversation to have. So that's where I would like to see it go. But I fully agree with you, Paul. I would like to see more historians in France looking at, if not the operational military side of this, but what military service in World War II meant to French citizens, what it meant to the community, what it meant to rebuilding France after the war, how that loss of faith in the French army in 1940, what did that mean for Indochina and Algeria going forward? I think those are enormous questions that people in France need to be asking. And I do hope that there are people who are going to start to ask them. Maybe as we get a little bit further from the events, it gets easier to do. And I also think how do I want to put this? The only perhaps silver lining in all of the BS that Vladimir Putin is doing and all of the horrible things that Russia is doing, it is forcing people to realize that war is not something we can put into a Pandora's box and lock the key. It is something that we need to be wrestling with. We need to be studying. We need to be understanding because it's something that isn't going away. The analogy that friends of mine like to use that I've picked up, it would be as if an oncologist just said, cancer is an ugly thing, we'll stop studying it. We have to be doing this. And I think you're getting an awareness of that in France as well.
No, definitely. I mean, I've had conversations with some of my French friends about the idea of in the future setting up some kind of We Have Ways festival in France, where we discuss history, but also maybe run some tanks around some fields and have some demonstrations and have beer tents. And they are aghast at the idea of bringing it into any kind of entertainment sphere. It doesn't mean they don't want to have the conversations, but the conversations, that's academic. You have that at a university, you have that at a conference where people wear suits and blazers. And when I tell them about the thousands of people who would turn up to that, and I don't even mention reenactments in the USA because that would just tip them over the limit. But they don't understand that there's a group of people in our countries that World War II is a hobby. It's something you collect. The France has a bit of that, but not in the same extent. And Susan, we got viewers. We'll do a couple of viewers' questions. Susan says, "Do you think?"
May I jump on that for just a second?
Yes,
I mean, I also think that in the U.S. and Britain, we have depicted this as the quote unquote good war. The almost unadulteratedly pure war. In France, it is not that at all. It is a very dirty, nasty, unpleasant experience. And if you do these things like reenactments and We Have Ways fests, you're going to stir up a lot of internal family issues and ask a lot of questions. It's a very different feeling in France or Germany, say, than it is. I mean, I'm talking to folks. I'll be in Germany next year for the 80th anniversary of VE Day. It should come as no surprise to anybody that Berlin doesn't want to do anything. That should come as no surprise. I'm sure in the United States, there's going to be some grand, huge whatever here in Washington at this gigantic memorial that we built in Washington. There will be nothing of the kind, probably anywhere in Europe, maybe London. but probably not anywhere else. And there's a reason for that.
And Dr. Phil Blardy's in Aachen, and he said it could never happen in Germany. And that's the that's
Yeah.
kind of where we are with this. And
Yeah.
it's viewed in different ways. And I was talking to Garrett earlier, the previous show. To some extent, the greatest generation mythology, not mythology, because it is true they are a good generation, but we've managed to mask some of the cracks in our story. We've masked some of the races, and we've masked some of the fact that not every soldier wanted to go to war, and there were deserters, and there were cowards. But the French have even more skeletons in the cupboard than we Western allies have, perhaps.
And look, we also have to recognize that in the United States, at least, the Second World War is now stands in contrast to Vietnam, to the Middle East wars that appear these, frustrating, inconclusive, nothing good ever really happened. Whereas World War II looks like an unadulterated good thing. I'd love to talk to students here when they go that direction and talk about all of the complex problems that come out at the end of the Second World War. It is not an unadulterated, pure good thing. It's as close as you're going to get, I think, in military history.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that World War II ends and all the problems are solved, right? I mean, China, Middle East, nuclear weapons, what the Soviets are doing, rebuilding France. I mean, these are massive, massive problems that come out of the war. So I think in the United States, Yugoslavia, I think in the United States, we need a slightly more, not slightly, we need a vastly more complex understanding of the Second World War rather than the one that Hollywood has given us. But that has not been the case, obviously, in France, where the end of the war is unbelievably complex. An entirely new Fourth Republic is created. It's an entirely different France that comes out of that war.
So we've kind of answered the question, but I said I'd put up. So Susan was saying, basically, do you think the French are tired of the war?
Yeah, I think that there's been a couple of, there's a television show that was on Netflix here in the US for a little bit about the Vichy experience. There is an appetite in France for fiction, for movie, for TVs. It's not as if it's completely absent from the culture. A very long engagement, this book by Sébastien Japrissot that was an enormous hit in France. That was about World War I, not World War II. But I just don't think it occupies the same place in the culture that it does in the Anglo-American world. There isn't this sense of a greatest generation. There cannot be in France when you have the Vichy experience, layered over this. So I don't know that I would say that they're tired of it. It just simply doesn't. I think, Paul, you're exactly right. The notion of this war or the First World War as entertainment in any shape or form is a foreign concept to the French. And I brought a French friend of mine to the Gettysburg battlefield, and the gift shop there is enormous. It's like a Fnac in Gettysburg, and it sells, Abraham Lincoln thumb drives and Robert E. Lee pencil erasers. And my French friends there was nothing in their head that could understand that. And I have to say, my view on war is much closer to the French one, I think, than it is to the American one. It's very hard for me to see why anybody would want to bring home a Robert E. Lee USB drive. It's just not in my mentality. This is serious stuff. And that's very much the French approach, that this is not entertainment and it's not commercialism, right? This is to be studied. It's to be understood with very much a never again mentality.
Well, the commercial aspect, if you were here, we talked before going live about what's going on in Normandy right now, some of which I love and some of which I find a bit odd, but the commemorative cider stall just beside Pegasus Bridge kind of stopped me in my tracks a bit. And then one of my friends said, but that'd be the first place the Ox and Bucks would run to is the site. I thought, okay, that's another angle there. But really fascinating. We hinted at the empire, but really fascinating question from Trevor Sheehan, who is doing sterling work researching the Battle of Tunisia. Thank you, Trevor, for what you're doing. What was happening at the political power in French North Africa at this time?
It's a great question, Trevor, and one that I confess I only know enough about to answer a quick question and then probably be told that I missed something. I was fascinated when I did the Vichy research. The Americans, in part, one of the reasons the Americans wanted to put Vichy back in power in North Africa is that the Americans had absolutely no faith that the North Africans could govern themselves. This very paternalistic Wilsonian sort of view that these people are not yet ready for self-government. Whereas the Tunisians and the Algerians, some of the nationalist leaders in those places were saying, look, you just can't you can't have all of this happen and then give us back to the French. Like you just can't do it. So there is this moment, I think, in the Second World War, even more than the First, where there are Algerian and Tunisian leaders, a whole generation that's going to come up that reject both the French idea and the American idea, that they need to be governed by Europeans until they develop some sort of sense, some sort of capability of self-government. It's a very paternalistic, infantilizing idea. So I was kind of fascinated by this when I was doing my Vichy book research, that this is one of the things driving the Americans to say, we're going to keep Vichy officials in power. One of the reasons is we think these children, these noble savages in North Africa, are utterly incapable of governing themselves. And it is, of course, if you're doing work in this, you know this better than I do. It is that generation that's going to come and run Tunisia and Algeria immediately after independence in the 1950s. So the Second World War has an enormous impact intellectually, in part because of the standard kind of American problem in both world wars, where we talk about self-determination and we talk about governance and we talk about democracy, and then we say, well, these groups can get it, but these groups cannot. And that message comes through loud and clear to it's a small and well-educated, but quite determined nationalist group in Tunisia, in Algeria, and of course in Indochina, where they receive exactly the same message, that the Americans talk a good game, but if we want our independence and we want our ability to control our own destinies, we're going to have to wrest it out of France's hands.
Well, great point. I've got a couple of questions from the viewers there, but I've been meaning to try and ask all my guests today kind of a trite interviewer's question, but I know we brought you on to talk about the French, but of course you are American, I'm British. What does D-Day mean to you? Does it mean the same as it did now that it did 20, 30 years ago? What's your opinion about it? Is it a turning point? Is it what's the Mike Neiberg lowdown?
I think it is actually the moment when the United States really has to begin to wrestle with the larger political problem of what America's relationship to Europe will be. I think it is the moment when Americans come to the realization that Europe without an American security presence involved may not, in fact, be in America's interest. And this is a debate that goes on and on. It's going on today. But I think it's the moment when the United States begins to realize, unlike World War I, we have to, this is Harry Truman's core belief, keep the ideals of Woodrow Wilson, but back them with instruments of hard power. So put the United States as a presence in Europe. And again, he goes back and forth on this until about 1948, when the Americans sort of finally decide there will be an American presence in Europe, and European security will be predicated, Western European security will be predicated upon an American presence. And I think it's D-Day that begins to merge that military and political question together. That's not how I would have thought of it 20 years ago, but I think it is, looking in the broader perspective of both world wars, the way I kind of see it now.
Thank you. This next question, possibly the last question, it's kind of one of those ones that at the end of a academic conference, it's like, oh, that's too big a question for the last one of the day. But we'll see what you react to. So Gary August is saying, does Michael think that the divided nature of France during occupation is a factor in the Fourth Republic mentality?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question really for French governance, I would argue, since the revolution, maybe even before, how strong a state do you want to have? So the stronger the state, the more you can keep the partisan bickering to a minimal level. But the stronger the state, the more the state can infringe upon the rights, the revolution, the inheritance of the revolution, which, as you know, the French guard very as a sacred birthright. So how do you get that balance right? The Fourth Republic's answer is a very weak executive. They don't want either the memory of what Pétain had done during the Vichy years. They also don't want anybody like de Gaulle coming in and taking over that. The same thing the Germans do, right? The Germans create a very decentralized government where the government in Bonn and then Berlin and the chancellor is actually quite limited in their power because the power is vested in the states, which is very different. The French Fourth Republic minimizes to a certain extent. It is de Gaulle who says that's not going to work. Like, if that's what you want to do, the government will be too unstable. So that's his big complaint with the Fourth Republic. That's why they switched from the Fourth Republic Constitution to the Fifth, which vests significantly more power in the office of the president. But this is the fundamental question in France. How centralized, how controlled the government do you want to have? The more control the government you have, the more efficient it can be, so that you don't run into the problems that, say, Italy ran into in the 40s and 50s, where the government is changing every 3 weeks and nobody can get anything accomplished. On the other hand, France has certain experiences with authoritarian governments, and you want to make sure there are checks in that system. And I think you're still seeing that in the French political mind even today. So the simple answer to your question is yes, but I did the academic thing and gave you a much longer answer.
Well, that's what we wanted to do for. So, the last kind of thoughts we'll address really is this. It's the same old discussion I have with James Holland all the time about this focus on June the 6th as being, it has a neat starting point in the sense that, which it doesn't actually, but that the Germans hold the beaches at the end of the day and the Allies hold the beaches at the end of the day. And the people who come to Normandy, the people who are watching ceremonies today, some of them will just kind of switch off the end of it. And that's it. They're kind of, that's that chapter closed. And there's 76 more days of fighting in Normandy. Then there's the completion of World War II. And then there's what you're reminding us of, that it solves one problem of France's, or begins to solve one problem of France getting rid of its occupiers, but it just opens up many more problems, as it does for every other country there, of what is meant by empire and the civil wars that break out in Greece, and we've listed all that. And that it just begins another era. It kind of ends one, but it's transitional in that sense, that it just brings more problems to the world. And this kind of, without appearing to be cynical on this important day, is that complexity of what 1944 does sometimes lost on those who just kind of put a bit of bunting in front of their house, which I've done with flags on it, and kind of breaking down D-Day, this kind of celebration, liberation, that we're actually losing sight of what a complex situation it kicks off.
Yeah, absolutely. We lose sight of Bagration, which happens a couple of weeks later on the Eastern Front, which is often left out of these discussions and really should not be left out of these discussions. I think the reason there's so much focus on June 6th is the real fundamental question: what happens if this doesn't work? What happens if the Allies are thrown back into the water? What happens if the Germans are able to contain that beachhead indefinitely? Then what happens? I think it's that drama that so captures our sense, and I think it's also what Paul Fussell called the great spectacle of war. I mean, that enormous concentration of military power to do something nobody had ever done before, to take a force that big, move it across water in bad weather against a determined opponent into a political environment that nobody could read, and yet it works. And I think you're 100% right. We have to understand it as the beginning of something. And as I just saw a comment pop up, I mean, I'm fond of talking to students that you have to think of history as a river. Like it came from somewhere and it's going somewhere, and you're bobbing up and down, and your perspective of it is going to matter depending on how you're bobbing up and down, and exactly how fast that river is moving, and exactly what kind of dangerous animals are living in that water. So, D-Day is a moment in that metaphorical and in this case, real choppy water. To me, it's that image. Every time I'm in Normandy and every time I'm standing at Omaha, what happens if this doesn't work? What does the war then look like? And it's that concentration of a moment of contingency that I think is so powerful about D-Day. But you're 1,000% right. The story needs to start there. It cannot end there, because of everything that's going on around it and everything that has to happen between that moment and the surrender of the Germans in May of 1945 in Berlin. So yeah, when I teach it, that's always what I do. I always try to use that as a beginning and then talk about, again, what is it that you're trying to accomplish, right? Yeah. What are you trying to do from a military perspective? What is it that Eisenhower has built this force to do? It is not to govern France.
Yeah.
It is to do something. It's not to occupy France. It is to do something very, very different.
No, well, great point there. And just remind you, folks, we have a week of Bagration content coming your way later this month. Steve Zaloga, Prit Buttar are just two of the guests we've lined up to talk about that.
Fabulous.
Hopefully find something about Finland as what's happening. That's happening at the same time as well. Finland's very complicated war, another area we haven't delved into enough. But you're very, very busy there with lots of things going on. So I'm going to let you go. And we've got one more show in 15 minutes time with talking about one of the troop carrier groups on D-Day. But Michael, as always, I've enjoyed every second talking to you. I hope we can meet up again sometime in France in the near future. If not, I'll meet you over there or something. But it's been great talking to you. And thanks, everybody, for your fantastic comments and questions. So, Mike, enjoy the rest of your day. Folks, I'll see you in 15 minutes.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.